German tanks were only 12 kilometers from Moscow in December 1941. Field Marshal Fedor von Bock recently oversaw an anti-Soviet campaign that was incredibly successful. "We are capable of winning," he declared with assurance. But in a few days, Bock would be free of his order. The field marshal who came closest to defeating the Soviet Union is the subject of this tale, only to have his goals dashed by his own Führer, not the enemy. Fedor von Bock was born in Küstrin, Prussia, on December 3, 1880, into a family with a long history in the military. Moritz von Bock, his father, had ordered his uncle, Max von Bock und Polach, would command German armies in World War I, and he served in the Franco-Prussian War. This upbringing prepared Fedor for his military career, which he started when he was 8 years old, Berlin's Gross Lichterfelde Cadet Academy. Bock was promoted to captain by 1914 when World War I broke out. He showed remarkable tactical abilities throughout the fight, especially in mobile combat. He received the Pour le Mérite, Prussia's highest military honor, for his leadership. Bock was greatly impacted by the events that followed Germany's defeat in World War I. His ingrained sense of allegiance to the crown was put to the test by the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles and the fall of the German monarchy. In the 1920s, Bock became involved in the creation of the Black Reichswehr, a covert military force that permitted Germany to continue having military capability in defiance of treaty limitations. In the early 1930s, when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party gained power, Bock was faced with a moral conundrum. Because he was a monarchist, he had little personal connection to the Nazi philosophy. But in the end, his feeling of obligation compelled him to work for the new government. As the 1930s went on, Bock's standing as a brilliant tactician made him a vital member of the Wehrmacht, which was growing quickly. His proficiency in mobile combat was crucial, vital part in the formulation of German military doctrine. Bock was prepared to lead Germany's soldiers into Poland on the brink of World War II in 1939, which would usher in a conflict that would fundamentally alter the course of history. The moral concessions made by many German military leaders of his generation are best illustrated by Bock's career under the Nazi government. His readiness to assist the dictatorship, even though he might not have fully accepted Nazi philosophy, was a major factor in Germany's early wartime victories. Bock led Army Group North in the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, just when Europe was on the verge of war. The operation demonstrated the Wehrmacht's groundbreaking strategy for fighting, which combined overwhelming power, speed, and cooperation. Bock's troops, featuring General Günther von Kluge's Fourth Army and General Georg von Küchler's Third Army, carried out a campaign that stunned the world and prepared the ground for the eventual greater struggle. Germany's blitzkrieg tactics proved to be effective throughout the Polish campaign. With previously unheard-of speed, Bock's soldiers overran Polish lines and destroyed their capacity to launch successful counterattacks. Within 5 weeks, the combined power of German and Soviet armies caused Poland to fall. By the end of the occupation, Poland had suffered a terrible loss, with 531 towns and villages in ruins. Bock took over as army commander in May 1940. Group B for the French invasion. The high leadership of Germany came up with a daring scheme to get over the Maginot Line, the massively reinforced defensive line that France had constructed along its eastern border. Bock's troops were essential to carrying out this plan. This resulted in a stunning German triumph and took the Allies by surprise. France, which had long been regarded as one of Europe's most powerful militaries, was overthrown in just 6 weeks. In appreciation of Bock's efforts, Hitler elevated him to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940. But tensions between Hitler and Bock started to simmer underneath the exterior. When Bock led Army Group Center in the seizure of Moscow during Operation Barbarossa, which began in June 1941, these tensions would reach a breaking point. At first, Bock's forces were incredibly successful, moving quickly and seizing important such as Smolensk and Minsk. But Bock and Hitler's strategic differences grew more intense. Bock maintained momentum was essential. Thus, he urged for a direct and quick drive towards Moscow. "We are permitting," he said. "This constraint on our armor is our best chance of success escaping us." But before advancing farther into Russian territory, Hitler insisted on massive encirclement conflicts to decimate Soviet soldiers. This strategy resulted into escalating hostility between Hitler and Bock. Like many other German generals, Bock thought they had a short window of time to overcome the Soviet Union, and that the risks to the overall operation increased with each delay. Bock got ready to begin Operation Typhoon, a major onslaught meant to seize Moscow in the fall of 1941. He launched a force of about 1.5 million men on September 30th, exceeding even Operation Barbarossa's initial strength. Germany had one last chance to triumph before winter arrived with their decisive push on the Soviet capital. The operation started off with remarkable results. Bock's forces captured about 650,000 Soviet soldiers after achieving substantial encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. But these early triumphs were quickly eclipsed by increasing difficulties that would put the German military machine to the test. Bock's worries were clear as fall drew near. When German soldiers eventually continued their push into Moscow, the delays proved to be expensive. Unpaved roads became dangerous mud bogs by mid-October, when the weather turned against the invaders. German trucks and tanks were engulfed in the muck. More time was spent pushing trucks than engaging in combat by the German army. The once dominant panzer divisions significantly slowed as they advanced at less than 2 miles per day. The German advance, allowing the Soviets to fortify their defenses in time. Bock ordered a series of flanking movements to get around the worst of the mud because he was irritated with the delayed approach. Despite their early effectiveness, these tactical choices put further strain on already overburdened supply lines. According to reports, approximately 35,000 men, the mud and inadequate supply condition resulted in the loss of several hundred vehicles and 250 tanks. The Russian winter presented the German forces with a new foe as temperatures fell to as low as minus 45 degrees Celsius. Moscow's defenses, however, were bolstering quickly. Georgy Zhukov, Marshal recruited citizens to build defensive structures after being recently selected to head the city's defense. Belts encircling the capital. Women built barricades and excavated anti-tank ditches, while armed factory workers organized into militia formations. Bock continued to move toward Moscow in spite of these obstacles. But as the Germans drew nearer, they ran into more adamant Soviet opposition. Around Mozhaisk, as panic swept across Moscow and residents started to flee, the German advance slowed to a crawl. As the German forces fought to hold their positions on December 6, 1941, Zhukov began a huge counterattack. The weary and paralyzed German troops were taken by surprise by the Soviet offensive and were forced to make a last-ditch withdrawal. Bock's soldiers were forced to retreat more than 80 kilometers from Moscow by December 13th. The Wehrmacht's retreat proved disastrous. According to German documents, at this time, more than 100,000 soldiers, 300 tanks, and thousands of vehicles and artillery pieces were lost by the Army Group Center. The failure of Bock's Operation Typhoon signaled a sea change in the Eastern Front conflict. The legend of the Soviet Union had weathered its darkest period, and German invincibility had been destroyed. Operation Typhoon's defeat was a watershed moment for Bock, with ramifications that extended well beyond the battlefield. December 18, 1941. Bock's health issues led Hitler to remove him from his position as Army Group Center commander. But the real reason for this choice was more nuanced, resulting from Bock's candidness and Hitler's waning faith in his generals. Bock continued his military career in spite of this setback. He was given command of Army Group South on January 20, 1942, after Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau passed away. On the Eastern Front, this job turned out to be Bock's last chance to show off his tactical prowess. Bock's command was put to the test during the Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942. Army Group South was the target of a winter onslaught by Soviet forces, but Bock masterfully planned a defense. He effectively repulsed the assault and dealt the Soviet soldiers heavy casualties. Bock's advance divided the Russian front in Kursk on June 28, 1942. The Soviet High Command responded by creating the Voronezh Front, which was led by Nikolai Vatutin, and directly to Moscow. In order to keep his own positions open and exposed as the German offensive advanced, Bock worked to swiftly destroy Vatutin's soldiers. Hitler, however, was against delaying the attack on Stalingrad, and as a result, Tensions between Bock and Hitler intensified. Their arguments on tactics and strategy came to a head. Hitler divided Army Group South into Army Groups A and B after reorganizing it on July 7th. Army Group A was placed under the command of Field Marshal Wilhelm List. July 17th, 1942. Bock's active military career came to an end when Hitler removed him from his position as commander of Army Group B. The moral dilemmas that Nazi military officers faced were brought to light by Bock's termination. Throughout his career, Bock managed to strike a balance between his personal and professional obligations. Regarding Nazi philosophy, due to his great sense of duty and devotion to the soldier's oath, he decided not to participate in plots against Hitler like several other generals did. Bock felt obligated by this promise to support the government and its ruler regardless of his disagreement with their policies. He was also reluctant because he believed in military discipline and was afraid that a coup may lead to civil war. After being fired, Bock fell into relative obscurity for a number of years. The once famous field marshal observed the disintegration of the Reich he had served from a distance. Bock lived in solitude close to Lübeck, considering the